It is a little after midnight on September the 12th, 1683, and on top of a wooded ridge outside Vienna, several thousand exhausted men are standing in the rain, looking down at a fire that has no end. They have been marching for days. Some accounts describe them cutting their own path through dense forest because no road existed where they needed to go. Their boots are soaked through. Their horses have been eating leaves because the supply wagons could not keep pace. And below them, spread across the plain between two rivers, is a sea of Ottoman campfires so vast that soldiers who had fought their whole lives said they had never seen anything like it. Somewhere down there, an empire that has not lost a major war in generations believes it is one final push away from taking the most important city in Central Europe. Up on the ridge, a coalition of exhausted, half-starved, badly outnumbered soldiers is about to try to stop them. Most people who know the broad strokes of European history have heard of Rome. They have heard of the Mongols. Fewer have heard of what happened on this hillside, even though historians still argue that it reshaped the next 300 years of the continent. And here is the number that gets repeated the most, the one in almost every headline about this battle: 300,000 Ottoman soldiers. It sounds almost too large to be real, and if your instinct is to be skeptical of that number, you are right to be. Modern historians disagree sharply on the true size of the army that marched on Vienna, and we are going to walk through exactly why that number exists, where it likely came from, and what the more careful estimates actually suggest. Because the real story here is not really about who had more men. It is about how an empire, at the absolute height of its power, with every apparent advantage, managed to lose in about 15 hours to a coalition that almost didn't show up at all. To understand how that happened, we have to go back a few years earlier, to the moment an ambitious man convinced a sultan that the time had finally come to finish what his predecessors had failed to do 150 years before. Before we go further, if stories like this one, real military history told with the actual uncertainty and nuance intact, are the kind of thing you want more of, this channel is built around exactly that. A quick subscribe helps more of these get made. Now, back to Vienna. By the early 1680s, the Ottoman Empire was not a fading power. It was, by most measures, near the peak of its reach. Its armies had humbled rivals for generations. Its administration stretched from North Africa to the Persian frontier, and for 150 years one city had represented unfinished business. Vienna, the gateway the Ottomans had failed to take back in 1529, when Suleiman, the Magnificent's army, turned back at its wall. That failure had never really gone away. It sat in Ottoman strategic memory, the way a near miss sits with anyone who almost got what they wanted. Vienna controlled the Danube. It was the door into the heart of the Holy Roman Empire, into Germany, into everything the Ottomans had not yet touched. Taking it would not just be a conquest, it would be a correction, 150 years overdue. The man who would push hardest to make that correction happen was Kara Mustafa Pasha, the Grand Vizier of the Empire, the Sultan's chief minister, and the effective commander of Ottoman military policy. We don't need his whole biography to understand what mattered about him. What mattered was this: he had already made a name for himself campaigning in Ukraine, and against Poland he had real military credibility, and he wanted more than credibility. He wanted to be remembered as the man who finally took Vienna. Some later accounts suggest he may even have hoped to govern the city himself once it fell. Whether that particular detail is fully accurate is debated, but the underlying pattern is clear from how the campaign was run. This was personal for him, not just strategic. He had a convenient excuse to move. In Habsburg-controlled Hungary, a nobleman named Imre Thököly was leading a rebellion of Hungarian Protestants against Habsburg rule, and Thököly had been appealing to the Ottomans for support. That gave Kara Mustafa the political cover he needed. This was not framed as unprovoked conquest. it was framed as intervention on behalf of an ally against a common enemy. But here is the detail that most retellings skip past, and it is the detail that tells you this was never an impulsive decision. The Ottoman military did not simply march on Vienna. It took well over a year to get there. Mobilization began in the winter of 1681 into 1682. War was formally declared in August of that year. Engineers repaired roads, bridges were rebuilt, supply depots were stocked with ammunition months before a single soldier crossed into Habsburg territory. This was a campaign built the way you build something you intend to finish. On the other side of that slow-moving storm sat Emperor Leopold I, ruler of a sprawling, multi-ethnic Habsburg realm that was, on paper, far weaker than the empire bearing down on it. Leopold's problem was not just external. It was that holding his own territory together was almost as difficult as fighting off invaders. Different regions, different loyalties, a rebellion already burning in Hungary. He did not have the luxury of a unified, single-minded state behind him, and this is where the campaign's slow pace becomes, in hindsight, one of the strangest ironies in the whole story. That long build-up, the 15 months between Ottoman mobilization and the actual assault on Vienna, gave Leopold something he desperately needed: time. Time to reinforce the city's defenses, time to negotiate, and most critically, time to do something that should have been difficult, but somehow worked. Time to build an alliance with a kingdom that, on the surface, had no obvious reason to rush to Vienna's aid. That kingdom was Poland, ruled by John III Sobieski, a battle-tested king with real cavalry power behind him. In the spring of 1683, Leopold and Sobieski formalized a defensive pact, the Treaty of Warsaw. Leopold promised that if the Ottomans or their allies ever threatened Kraków, Habsburg forces would come to Poland's defense. In exchange, Sobieski committed to send help if Vienna itself came under direct attack. It was a mutual insurance policy between two rulers who each knew they were probably too weak to face the Ottoman threat completely alone. Pope Innocent XI worked hard behind the scenes to make this alliance happen, and he also tried, without success, to bring France's Louis XIV into the coalition. Louis stayed out of it, and for good reason from his own perspective. France and the Ottoman Empire had a long, complicated, occasionally cooperative relationship, close enough that critics sometimes mockingly called Louis the most Christian of Turks. Europe in 1683 was not one unified Christian front standing shoulder to shoulder against a common enemy. It was a patchwork of rival interests that had to be talked, bribed, and pressured into cooperating even partially. Meanwhile, inside Vienna, ordinary people were living with a very specific kind of fear, the kind that comes from inherited memory. Vienna had faced this exact threat before, in 1529, and the city had survived that siege by a narrow margin. Grandparents told grandchildren about it. It was not abstract history to the people watching Ottoman forces slowly assemble on the horizon in the summer of 1683. It was the return of something they had been warned about their whole lives. And here is where both sides made the same fundamental error, just from opposite directions. Ottoman leadership looked at a fractured, internally strained Habsburg realm and concluded it was weak enough to be beaten quickly, possibly even before serious outside help could arrive. Habsburg leadership, for much of the early planning phase, assumed that if the Ottomans struck at all, they would go after border fortresses first, the usual pattern, not risk everything on a direct strike at Vienna itself. Both assumptions were wrong, and both sides were about to find that out in the most expensive way possible. By July of 1683, the slow-moving machine that Kara Mustafa had spent over a year building finally arrived at its target. Advanced Tatar cavalry from the Crimean Khanate, tens of thousands of horsemen, reached the outskirts of Vienna first on the 7th of July. Emperor Leopold made the difficult decision to evacuate, leaving the city along with tens of thousands of civilians A decision that has drawn criticism over the centuries, but that also had a hard military logic behind it. Fewer mouths to feed inside a besieged city means a longer siege. The defenders can actually survive. On the 14th of July, the main Ottoman army arrived and began the siege in earnest. Vienna's defense was placed in the hands of a career officer named Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg, and he had somewhere around 15,000 men to hold a city against a force that outnumbered him by a wide margin. Depending on which contemporary estimate you trust, somewhere between 5 and 10 times as many, possibly more. Neither side, at this point, fully understood what the next 2 months were going to cost them, or what a forest west of the city, a forest almost nobody thought an army could move through, was about to do to all of their careful planning. To understand what came next, you need a picture of the ground itself, because in this story, geography is not background scenery. Geography is one of the main characters. Vienna sits where the Danube River curves, through a landscape framed by hills and forest to the west, the Vienna Woods, and a smaller river, the Wien, running closer to the city itself. Those rivers were not just pretty features on a map. They were natural walls, obstacles that shaped where an army could move quickly and where it would get bogged down. Any commander planning to attack or defend this city had to think in terms of water and slope, not just soldiers and cannon. And here is the assumption almost everyone on the Ottoman side seems to have made, whether stated out loud or simply baked into their planning. A large, organized relief army was not going to come crashing out of that forest to the west. The terrain was too difficult. The going would be too slow. If help came for Vienna, it would come along easier, more predictable routes that could be watched and blocked. That assumption was about to become the single most expensive mistake of the entire campaign, but it would take weeks for that to become clear. While Vienna's defenders dug in under Starhemberg, the Ottoman military machine that had taken over a year to assemble finally converged on the city. Advance forces from the Crimean Khanate, tens of thousands of Tatar horsemen, had already arrived ahead of the main army. Forces from Hungary and Transylvania, drawn in by the rebellion Kara Mustafa had used as his pretext, joined the growing camp outside the walls. Inside those walls, roughly 15,000 defenders faced the job of holding out against a besieging force that most estimates place somewhere between 100,000 and 170,000 men, though it is worth repeating clearly here. Contemporary and later sources disagree substantially on the exact figure, some pushing the number even higher. What is not in dispute is the basic shape of the problem. Starhemberg's garrison was outnumbered by a wide margin, and everyone inside those walls knew it. The forces arrayed against each other were built very differently, and those differences mattered enormously once the fighting actually started. The core of the Ottoman army rested on 2 pillars. First, the Janissaries, professional infantry, drilled, disciplined, armed with muskets, considered among the most reliable troops the empire could field. Second, the Sipahi cavalry, feudal horsemen who formed the backbone of Ottoman mounted power, supported by lighter Akinji raiders used for scouting and harassment, and by the enormous Tatar cavalry force from Crimea. Behind all of that stood Ottoman combat engineers, sappers whose job was to dig, approach trenches toward the city walls and pack them with explosives. A slow, grinding, almost surgical method of siege warfare that had already worked for the Ottomans many times before. On the other side, the forces gathering to relieve Vienna were a patchwork by comparison, and that patchwork is exactly why coordinating them was going to be so difficult. Habsburg and German infantry fought with muskets and pikes in the increasingly standardized drill formations that had become common across much of 17th-century Europe, units trained to move and fire as a coordinated block rather than a loose crowd. Supporting cavalry included armored cuirassiers and more mobile dragoons. And then there was Poland's contribution, the force that would ultimately define the popular memory of this entire battle. The winged hussars. Heavy cavalry, riding with wooden frames mounted with feathers rising from their backs or saddles, designed in part to create noise and a strange, unsettling visual effect meant to unnerve enemy horses and enemy soldiers alike. Their primary weapon was a lance over 15 feet long, made from light, sometimes hollowed wood, strong enough to punch through formations on a single devastating charge, fragile enough that it was often good for exactly one use before shattering, at which point the riders switched to sabers, warhammers, or pistols for the close, chaotic fighting that followed. It was sometimes said that a hussar unit was only good for one day of real fighting. But if you got that one day right, it could decide everything. The man who would eventually lead that cavalry into battle, John III Sobieski, King of Poland, made his own high-risk decision in mid-August. On the 15th, he marched his army out of Krakow, honoring the defensive pact he had signed with Leopold months earlier. But honoring that pact meant leaving Poland itself almost undefended, a gamble that immediately invited trouble. With Sobieski's forces gone, Thokoli's Hungarian rebels saw an opening and attempted incursions into Polish territory while the king was away. Sobieski was betting his own kingdom's short-term safety on the idea that saving Vienna mattered more. Even getting the relief force organized was not simple. Sobieski's Lithuanian contingent, under a commander named Sapieha, got delayed campaigning elsewhere in Hungary and would not reach Vienna until after the battle was already decided, missing the fight entirely. And once Polish and German forces were actually marching together, old tensions resurfaced almost immediately. Arguments over money, over who would pay for supplies and wages during the march, arguments serious enough that they threatened to poison cooperation between allies who badly needed each other. Habsburg leadership scrambled to find funds and cut deals to keep the coalition from fracturing before it had even fought its first battle together. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it cuts against the version of this story that gets told in simplified form. This was not a clean, unified Christian Europe marching in perfect harmony to save one of its own. It was an alliance held together by mutual necessity, by treaties signed under pressure, by commanders who did not fully trust each other, and armies that had never fought side by side before. If it worked, it was going to be despite significant friction, not because everything went smoothly. By early September, the pieces were finally converging. Charles of Lorraine, commanding Habsburg and allied German forces, had spent weeks maneuvering, at one point pulling his troops back toward Linz rather than risk a premature clash with the much larger Ottoman army. A retreat that was not cowardice but calculation, buying time until Sobieski's Poles could arrive and the combined force could actually stand a chance. Once Sobieski crossed the Danube northwest of Vienna in early September with his own army, the two forces united under his overall command, an arrangement that says something about the respect his reputation commanded even among commanders from other kingdoms. Their route toward Vienna took them directly into the terrain everyone had assumed was impassable for a large army, the Vienna Woods. It was not an easy passage. Later accounts describe brutal conditions on the final approach, difficult ground, worsening weather, a punishing pace that forced units to abandon supplies just to keep moving. Soldiers went hungry. Horses were reduced to eating leaves along the trail because the wagons carrying proper fodder could not keep up with the march. And through the night of September, the 11th, as artillery crews under Charles of Lorraine's orders hauled cannon up onto the heights of the Kahlenberg to prepare positions for the coming assault, exhausted men tried to rest within earshot of an enemy camp, so large its sounds carried up the hillside, chants, the boom of bombardment still falling on Vienna's walls below, robbing many soldiers of what little sleep they might otherwise have gotten. And yet, according to multiple accounts, morale held. That detail matters, because it is easy to imagine an army in that condition simply falling apart. This one did not. Down below, inside a headquarters camp that had grown almost into a small city of its own around Kara Mustafa, the mood was very different. Ottoman sappers had already achieved what looked like a decisive breakthrough. Weeks of tunneling and controlled explosions had chewed through Vienna's outer defences, and by early September, Ottoman engineers were dangerously close to opening a real breach in the inner walls. Starhemberg's garrison, worn down by 2 months of continuous siege, was holding on by threads. From where Kara Mustafa stood, victory looked close enough to touch. And that proximity to victory is exactly what shaped the decision that would define everything that followed. Every available resource, every disciplined unit, including many of his most reliable Janissary troops, remained committed to the siege lines surrounding the city, focused entirely on finishing the job in front of them. Scouting and screening toward the western approaches, the direction from which a relief force would have to come, if it came at all, was thin. Not because Ottoman commanders were careless people, but because the terrain to the west had always been assumed to make a serious threat from that direction unlikely. It was a reasonable bet, given everything the Ottoman command believed about that forest. It was also about to be proven catastrophically wrong. By the night of September the 11th, both sides had done everything within their power to prepare. Cannon were in position on the Kohlenberg heights. Ottoman engineers stood ready to press their advantage at the walls the moment daylight allowed. Every plan that could be made had been made. No plan accounted for what 15 months of build-up, months that had felt so methodical, so carefully calculated, had actually purchased for the other side. Just enough time and just enough desperation to attempt something through a forest that was never supposed to hold an army at all. Quick question before we get into the fighting itself. If you were commanding the defense of Vienna, worn down after 2 months under siege, would you have trusted the walls to hold just a little longer, or trusted a relief army coming through terrain everyone said was impossible? Drop a one-word answer in the comments, walls or forest. I'll check back in and see which one wins. Dawn on September the 12th broke over a battlefield that neither side had fully mapped in their own minds, because neither side had truly believed this particular confrontation on this particular ground was going to happen. As the light came up, Ottoman lookouts along the northern and western edges of the siege lines began to see movement on the ridges above them. First scattered figures, then formations, then unmistakably an army coming down out of the Vienna Woods, exactly where Ottoman planning had assumed no serious force could arrive. For Kara Mustafa, this presented an immediate and brutal problem. He was, at that exact moment, closer than he had ever been to breaking through Vienna's inner walls. Ottoman sappers had spent weeks clawing toward a breach, and abandoning that effort now, after 2 months of siege, after so much invested, was not something he was prepared to do. So he did not choose between finishing the siege and meeting the threat on the ridge. He tried to do both at once. That decision split his attention and his forces at the exact moment he needed neither divided. Troops were pulled toward the high ground to meet the approaching coalition army, while a substantial portion of his most reliable units, including many of his janissaries, remained committed to the siege trenches surrounding the city, still grinding toward that almost completed breach. From where Kara Mustafa stood, this must have looked like the correct call. He still believed, with good reason given the numbers, that he held an overwhelming advantage. Why abandon a siege on the verge of success because of one army coming down from a forest his own scouts had told him was nearly impassable? But dividing an army under sudden pressure rarely produces clean results, and it would not here either. Ottoman forces scrambled to form a defensive line, facing the ridge with less preparation and less coordination than the situation demanded. On the coalition side, exhausted men who had marched through brutal terrain the night before, men who had gone hungry, whose horses had been eating leaves, began moving into position along the high ground, looking down at a besieging army so vast that some later accounts describe soldiers who had fought their whole careers admitting they had never seen anything like it. The first phase of the day was not a grand clash of massed armies. It was smaller, messier, the kind of fighting that happens when two forces are still figuring out where the other one actually is. Skirmishes broke out along the flanks as coalition units pushed down from the wooded high ground into more open terrain near villages called Nussberg and Breitensee. On the Ottoman right, forces under a commander named Kara Mehmed Pasha, drawing on troops from Bosnia and the wider Balkan territories under Ottoman control, worked to hold their ground against the initial pressure. This early fighting mattered less for what it decided and more for what it revealed. Coalition forces, despite their exhaustion, were moving with real discipline, infantry and cavalry units advancing in coordinated blocks rather than a chaotic rush. And on the Ottoman side, cracks were already visible in how the army was being deployed, a defense assembled under time pressure rather than by design, still leaning heavily on units that had spent 2 months digging trenches, not preparing for open battle on this scale. As the morning wore into midday, the fighting intensified without yet reaching a full crisis point for either side. Charles of Lorraine's forces pressed forward through difficult wooded terrain, an advance that was slow and grinding rather than dramatic. Exactly the kind of fighting where discipline under discomfort matters more than any single tactical flourish. Ottoman counterattacks probed for weaknesses in the coalition line, testing whether the exhausted, outnumbered force on the high ground would hold or fracture under pressure. It held. Not without difficulty, not without moments where officers had to fight to keep formations from breaking apart in the chaos of dense terrain and constant small engagements, but it held. Think for a moment about what these men were actually experiencing while all of this was happening at the level of maps and troop movements. Most of them had marched through the night before with almost no sleep. Many had not eaten a proper meal in more than a day. Their boots were still wet from the rain that had soaked the forest floor. The air along that ridge would have carried the smoke of 2 months of continuous bombardment drifting up from the city below, mixed with the smell of churned mud, gunpowder, and thousands of men and horses packed into terrain never designed to hold an army. Every advance through the trees meant fighting the ground itself as much as the enemy, branches and undergrowth, slowing formations that needed to stay tight to survive contact with Ottoman cavalry probing for gaps. And underneath all of it sat a simple, constant question that none of them could answer yet. Was this exhausting, grinding morning going to be remembered as the beginning of a rescue, or as the first stage of a disaster? And through these hours, the deeper strategic problem for Kara Mustafa was quietly getting worse, not better. Every hour, his siege troops remained locked in their trenches around Vienna. Rather than being pulled back to reinforce a proper field, defense was an hour that widened the gap between the army he actually had positioned to fight this new battle and the army he needed to win it. He was, in effect, still trying to win 2 different fights with forces that could not fully support each other. The fight for the walls and the fight for the ridge, and neither fight was getting his full strength. By early afternoon, something had shifted, and it was not a single dramatic event so much as an accumulation of small ones. The terrain that Ottoman planners had written off as an obstacle too difficult for a serious army to use, the forest and broken ground of the Vienna Woods, had done exactly the opposite of what was expected. It had not stopped the coalition army. It had hidden it, slowed Ottoman awareness of its approach, and let it arrive with more coordination intact than anyone watching from the Ottoman camp had anticipated. Sobieski, holding much of his heaviest cavalry in reserve rather than committing it to the grinding infantry engagements of the morning, watched from higher ground as Ottoman formations facing the ridge began to show real strain, stretched between the demands of the siege and the demands of this new fight, absorbing pressure on multiple fronts without the unified command structure that a battle like this required. This was the moment both commanders, in very different ways, faced a choice with no comfortable option. For the coalition, The question was whether to keep pushing forward through difficult terrain against a numerically superior force, risking catastrophic losses if the assault stalled, or to pull back, consolidate, and lose whatever momentum the day had built, potentially giving the Ottomans the one thing they still needed most: time to break through Vienna's walls before the field battle was decided. For Kara Mustafa, the question was whether to finally commit fully to the field battle, pulling his best troops out of the siege trenches to reinforce his strained lines on the ridge, or to trust that his current deployment could hold long enough for the siege to finish first. Lorraine and Sobieski chose to keep pushing. It was the riskier option in the moment, and it was also the one that kept the pressure building on an Ottoman command structure that was already stretched thin, trying to manage two battles at once instead of committing everything to either one. Kara Mustafa, for his part, did not pull his siege troops back in time. Whether out of confidence that his numerical advantage would ultimately decide things regardless, or simple unwillingness to abandon a siege that close to success, the reinforcements that might have stabilized his field position never fully arrived where they were needed most. It is exactly the kind of decision that looks defensible in the moment it is made, and catastrophic only in hindsight. Once you can see how the rest of the day actually unfolded, it is worth pausing on why that particular choice was so costly, because it was not simply a matter of having fewer men on the ridge than in the trenches. An army fighting on two separated fronts loses something harder to measure than raw numbers. It loses the ability to react as one body. Orders take longer to reach every part of the line. Commanders on the ridge cannot be certain what reinforcements, if any, are actually coming, or when. Soldiers can sense that uncertainty, even when nobody says it out loud. And uncertainty, more than exhaustion, is often what breaks a formation's nerve before it breaks its ranks. Every hour Kara Mustafa left his best troops locked into the siege lines was an hour his field command spent effectively fighting blind, without the reserves that could have turned a difficult afternoon into a stable one. By late afternoon, the strain on Ottoman formations facing the ridge was becoming visible even to soldiers in the ranks, not just to commanders reading the overall shape of the battle. Units that had been fighting since early morning, stretched to cover ground meant for a larger, more concentrated force, were beginning to show the kind of ragged coordination that precedes a collapse. Sobieski had been waiting for exactly this moment. Around 6 in the evening, with Ottoman lines along the ridge showing clear signs of exhaustion and disorder, he gave the order for the cavalry he had held in reserve through the day's earlier fighting to finally commit. What happened next is the image most people associate with this entire battle, even if they know almost nothing else about it. Tens of thousands of horsemen, the Polish winged hussars at their center, descending from the high ground in a single massed charge directly into the Ottoman lines below. It is often described as one of the largest cavalry charges in European history, and while historians debate the precise numbers involved, there is no real debate about its effect. Picture it from ground level, from inside the Ottoman formation facing that hillside. The sound comes first, a rolling thunder of hooves that grows instead of fading, which is not what exhausted, already stressed troops want to hear after a full day of fighting. Then the visual hits, thousands of riders coming down the slope with those distinctive feathered frames rising off their backs, an eerie, rattling silhouette that had been specifically designed over generations to unsettle both horses and men before a single lance made contact. Dust rises in a wall ahead of the charge. The smell of gunpowder from hours of fighting still hangs in the air, mixing now with churned earth and the sweat and fear smell of thousands of animals and men who know exactly what is about to hit them. And then the lances arrive. Each one over 15 feet of light, sometimes hollowed wood, built to punch through armor and formation alike in a single devastating pass, fragile enough that most would shatter on impact, which barely mattered. Because impact was the entire point. Ottoman formations, many of them without heavy plate protection, absorbed the full force of that charge and began to come apart, not gradually, but in the sudden, cascading way that happens when a formation's structural integrity fails all at once. Kara Mustafa himself, according to multiple accounts, rode personally into the chaos of his own collapsing center in what appears to have been an attempt to prevent the capture of the Ottoman army's sacred banner, a powerful symbolic object whose loss would represent something close to total humiliation. Surrounded by his personal cavalry guard, he pushed forward under a storm of German cannon and musket fire aimed at the crumbling center of his own line. He managed for a moment to keep hold of the banner. He could not keep hold of the battle. Around him, the army he had spent over a year building and more than 2 months feeding into a siege he had been so close to winning, simply came apart. On the Ottoman left, at nearly the same moment, forces that had rallied earlier near Breitensee broke as Sobieski's combined cavalry and infantry drove through them as well. There was no longer a single battle line to speak of. There were fragments, pockets of resistance, and a widening tide of men trying to get away from a hillside that had, in the space of a few hours, gone from the site of near Ottoman victory to the site of Ottoman catastrophe. Consider how fast that reversal actually happened. This was not a slow, grinding retreat spread across days, the kind you sometimes see when an army withdraws in good order. This was an army that, as recently as that same morning, had stood on the edge of finally taking Vienna after 2 months of siege, an army with every material advantage still technically in its favor, breaking apart within a matter of hours once its center gave way. Numbers alone did not do this. A single unaddressed vulnerability did, the same one that had been quietly building since Kara Mustafa first chose to fight on 2 fronts at once instead of one. What followed in the final hours of that evening was less a battle than a collapse in slow motion. Kara Mustafa, understanding by now that the field was lost, made a decision that says a great deal about the desperation of that moment. He ordered his remaining forces to stop the bombardment of Vienna entirely, to abandon the siege equipment that had taken so long to bring into position, and, in an act that stains this final chapter of the campaign, ordered the killing of captives being held in the Ottoman camp rather than let them fall back into coalition hands. Coalition troops pushed through what remained of organized Ottoman resistance and into the camp itself, a sprawling complex that had, over 2 months of siege, grown into something closer to a small city. Tents, supplies, livestock, and treasure accumulated across an entire military campaign. Among what they found was Kara Mustafa's own personal quarters, an enormous red command tent, abandoned in the chaos of retreat. By roughly 10 that night, after a final wave of resistance was cut down, the fighting on the field itself came to an end. It had lasted somewhere between 12 and 15 hours from the first skirmishes of the morning to the final collapse that evening, a single day that undid over a year of Ottoman planning and preparation. What remained afterward was not a clean battlefield, with 2 clearly defined armies, one victorious and one defeated. It was chaos in both directions. In the abandoned Ottoman camp, coalition soldiers found evidence of the killings Kara Mustafa had ordered, and in turn, in the confusion of the aftermath, Starhemberg's own garrison, worn down by 2 months of siege, is recorded as having killed a group of sick and wounded Ottoman soldiers left behind in the retreat, a grim reminder that the ugliness of this kind of warfare rarely stayed contained to the formal hours of battle. And discipline among the victors did not hold perfectly either. Rather than maintaining order across the captured Ottoman camp, many coalition soldiers, Sobieski's own Polish contingent included, broke into the kind of frantic looting that tends to follow a sudden, overwhelming victory over an enemy camp full of accumulated wealth. It would reportedly take almost a full week afterward just to catalogue and collect everything left behind. By nightfall on September the 12th, the army that had spent over a year being assembled, that had marched with total confidence toward what looked like the correction of a 150-year-old failure, was in full retreat, scattered, leaderless in any coordinated sense, and stripped of the momentum that had carried it all the way to the walls of Vienna. The siege was over. What came next would take much longer to fully play out. But the outcome of this one exhausting day had already decided most of it. Quick one before we move into the aftermath. Sobieski basically won this on the back of a single, all-in cavalry charge held in reserve until exactly the right moment. If you had to guess, was that patience, or was it luck that the timing happened to work out? Comment patience or luck. I'm curious what most of you think. In the days that followed, the scale of what had actually happened outside Vienna became clear, and it took time, because there was simply so much to account for. Coalition troops and Viennese civilians spent close to a full week going through the abandoned Ottoman camp, cataloguing what had been left behind. Tents, livestock, supplies, and treasure accumulated across an entire military campaign. Sobieski himself, writing to his wife shortly after the battle, described it as wealth unlike anything he had ever seen. It gives you a sense of just how completely the Ottoman army had collapsed, not a fighting retreat that preserved its equipment, but a rout so total that an entire military campaign's worth of material simply got left on the ground. The human cost was harder to pin down precisely, and it is worth being honest about that uncertainty, rather than pretending the numbers are cleaner than they are. Estimates for Ottoman losses during the battle itself range widely across different sources, some putting battlefield deaths in the range of 8,000 to 15,000, with several thousand more taken prisoner, and total losses across the full 2-month campaign, including the siege itself, likely reaching into the tens of thousands when disease, earlier fighting, and the final collapse are all counted together. Coalition losses were far lighter by comparison, though still real, estimates generally falling somewhere between 1,500 and 3,500 dead and wounded, a significant number of them Polish. The exact figures are genuinely disputed among historians, and we are not going to pretend otherwise by picking whichever number sounds most dramatic. For the man most responsible for the disaster, the consequences were swift and did not wait for a full accounting of the losses. Kara Mustafa fled the field with his life, but not with his reputation intact, and in the political culture of the Ottoman court, a defeat this total demanded someone to answer for it. He spent the following months trying to shift blame onto subordinate commanders, in some cases having them executed to deflect responsibility away from himself. It did not work. Sultan Mehmed IV was not convinced. On December the 25th, 1683, while staying in Belgrade, Kara Mustafa was executed by strangulation on the Sultan's order, and his head was sent back to Constantinople as proof the sentence had been carried out. The man who had spent over a year building this campaign to cement his own legacy became, instead, its final casualty. Inside Vienna, the mood was less celebratory triumph and more exhausted relief mixed with immediate, practical urgency. Starhemberg did not treat the victory as an ending. His first major order afterward was to begin repairing the city's badly damaged fortifications, on the reasonable assumption that an empire capable of assembling this campaign once could, in theory, tempt it again. As it turned out, Vienna would never again face a siege of this kind, but nobody standing inside those walls in the days immediately after the battle could have known that for certain. Caution, not celebration, defined the first response. Word of the victory spread outward across Europe quickly, carried in no small part by Sobieski's own letters, including a message to the Pope that would become one of the most quoted lines associated with the entire campaign, a paraphrase of Julius Caesar declaring that they had come, they had seen, and God had conquered. Whatever the precise wording of every version of that message, the underlying reaction across the courts of Christian Europe was the same: relief and a fair amount of surprise at how completely a threat that had looked nearly unstoppable just weeks earlier had come apart. If you could have walked the ridge above Vienna a few weeks after the battle, once the looting had ended and the wreckage had mostly been cleared away, you would have found something close to silence. Trampled ground slowly recovering, the scars of trenches and campfires fading into the hillside. No grand monument yet, no plaques, just an empty battlefield beginning the long, ordinary process of becoming a hillside again, indistinguishable on the surface from any other patch of ground outside any other European city. But the silence on that ridge was misleading. Nothing about the political map of Central Europe was actually standing still. The battle itself had lasted less than a full day. What it had set in motion was going to take years to finish playing out. In the years immediately following the battle, the strategic picture across Central Europe began shifting in ways that would have seemed unthinkable to Ottoman planners just months earlier. The defeat at Vienna did not end the Ottoman Empire's presence in Europe overnight, but it broke the momentum that had carried the campaign there in the first place. And momentum, once lost in a war like this, is brutally difficult to rebuild. Over the following 16 years, Ottoman forces were gradually pushed out of Hungary and Transylvania, territory that had been under Ottoman influence or direct control for generations, as the coalition that had formed to save Vienna evolved into a longer, sustained military effort against Ottoman positions across the region. The Habsburgs emerged from this as the clearest long-term beneficiaries, consolidating control over Hungary and strengthening their position as the dominant power in Central Europe for generations to come. And there was something else this campaign produced that outlasted the specific territorial gains. It was the first time the Holy Roman Empire and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had cooperated militarily on this scale, an alliance built out of necessity and friction as much as shared purpose, but one that nonetheless worked when it mattered most. Historians still debate exactly how large a turning point this single day represents in the broader 300-year rivalry between the Ottoman and Habsburg empires. It was not the final defeat of Ottoman power in Europe. That process would stretch on for generations. But most agree it marked the point after which the Ottomans never again seriously threatened to take Vienna, and never again mounted an offensive campaign into Central Europe on this scale. The high water mark had been reached, and then reversed, within the span of a single exhausting day. If there is a military lesson worth pulling out of all of this, separate from the drama of the cavalry charge everyone remembers, it is a fairly uncomfortable one. Overwhelming numerical advantage does not protect you from a single unaddressed vulnerability. Kara Mustafa did not lose because his army was weak. His army was, by nearly every measure available to him, stronger than what he ultimately faced on that ridge. He lost because he tried to win two fights at once with forces built to win one, and because the terrain he assumed would protect his flank turned out to be the exact route his enemy used to reach it. Discipline, coordination, and the willingness to commit reserves at precisely the right moment, not raw troop counts, decided this battle. That is a pattern that shows up again and again across military history. In campaigns separated by centuries and entirely different technology, and it is part of why this particular day still gets studied as closely as it does. It's also worth being honest about what this battle is not. It is often remembered, particularly in later retellings, as a clean, unified triumph of Christian Europe standing together against a common enemy. The reality, as we've walked through, was messier. This was an alliance held together by treaties signed under pressure, by commanders who argued over money even as they marched to fight side by side, by a France that stayed on the sidelines and had its own complicated relationship with the very empire everyone else was fighting. The victory was real. The unity behind it was far more fragile and far more improvised than the legend suggests. Picture that hillside one more time, the way we opened this story. Thousands of exhausted men in the rain, looking down at a sea of enemy campfires that seemed to have no end. They did not know, standing there in the dark hours before dawn, on September the 12th, whether they were about to save a city or die trying. Centuries later, that same hillside is quiet. Kahlenberg today is green, ordinary, dotted with vineyards and walking paths, the kind of place people visit for the view over Vienna rather than for what happened there. Almost nothing on the ground itself hints at what took place across those 15 hours, or at how close an empire came to rewriting the next 300 years of European history. Before a single exposed flank and a forest everyone had written off undid it all in an afternoon. If this kind of history, the version with the uncertainty left in, the sources that disagree, the alliances that weren't as clean as the legend, is something you want more of, that is exactly what this channel is for. Hit like if this helped you see this moment a little more clearly than the headline version usually does. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into the battles and empires that quietly reshaped the world most people don't spend much time thinking about. Thank you for watching all the way through this one. I'll see you in the next video. And maybe the next time you look at a quiet, empty hillside anywhere in the world, it's worth wondering what it might be hiding.